Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we are excited and honored to interview Janani Ramachandran. Janani is running for California State Assembly in District 18 in this year's special election coming up very, very soon. Janani is an East Bay native. She's a graduate of Stanford University and Berkeley Law. She's a social justice lawyer, an activist, and an artist who is relentlessly fighting to empower communities who, in her words, have been failed by our existing systems. We encourage everyone listening to please take a seat, really absorb Janani's vision for California, and support the campaign. Please help elect California's first Indian American Assemblywoman. Janani, thank you for speaking with us today. Without any further ado, let's get started. The very first thing I want to ask about is your core philosophies. You believe in, quote, bold solutions and leaders who have the courage to fight for them. So what makes you a bold candidate and what are the bold solutions that you stand for?
So, the reason that I'm running is because, like many of us, I'm very frustrated with California's state government. We have too many leaders who are just satisfied with the status quo, who are okay continuing ineffective, inefficient policies that don't serve the needs of people. I was inspired to run because I feel like our state government was not doing enough to help people during the pandemic in particular. And so my vision for running for office is being fearless in the fight for justice. I think it's time that we have leaders who are not scared to act because they have special interest groups whispering in their ear. I think it's time that we have leaders who are ready to fight for what they truly believe in, not just what they think is going to make them look good in the media or look favorable to certain corporate interests. That's what I mean when I say bold. There are a lot of candidates in races like this in districts like mine who like saying broad statements like housing is a human right, healthcare is a human right, and those are certainly my underlying values. But it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to actually want to fight to enact the policies that is going to actually make housing a human right, healthcare a human right, a living wage a human right, clean air a human right, education a human right.
And like you just mentioned, you are not accepting money or direct checks from any corporations, police unions, big pharma, the oil gas industry, or real estate developers. And I'm just curious to know what gateways does that decision open up for you in your potential future as the state assemblywoman? But also conversely, how do you overcome the fact that this decision might also close some doors for you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I feel like many of our state leaders are not bold and fearless, as I put it, is because they have special interest groups whispering in their ears. They have certain corporations, certain industries saying, you can't fight for that bill, or we want you to make sure that bill dies in session and is never passed. And I want to be an independent thinker. I want to be able to make decisions for myself on laws and bills that I want to see passed, on policies that I want to see being enacted, and I don't want to be influenced by anyone except for Californian voters. You know, the only people I am accountable to are my voters, are the people of California, um, not corporations, not specific industries. And to me, it certainly does not it only closes doors for avenues that I don't want to go down. I want to be a politician, a political leader, a public servant with integrity, with authenticity, because that's what I feel is lacking. We have a lot of politicians who say one thing and then secretly behind closed doors do another because of money. Oftentimes people think that, you know, in other countries, like India, for example, politics is openly corrupt. But corruption happens every single day in our own state government. Some of the corruption is legal. A lot of the corruption is illegal. And we need to put an end to that. And that starts with being an independent policymaker and only being accountable to your voters, to the people of California.
I want to ask also about your background a little bit. You are the daughter and granddaughter of, in your words, immigrants from a small South Indian village who worked tirelessly every day to give you the opportunity to pursue your dreams. And I think that's something that so many of our viewers can relate to. Can you explain to me how your upbringing informed your decision to dedicate yourself to social justice and how it would inform your outlook as a future potential state assemblywoman?
Absolutely. So, on my mom's side, my grandparents immigrated to New York City in the early 70s with my mom and her brother. And immigrating, uh, anyone who's an immigrant has gone through so many struggles and so many challenging life experiences. But they did that so that their kids can have a better life, so that their grandkids can have a better life. And they sacrificed so much, leaving their communities behind, leaving everything they know to move to a foreign land where they barely spoke the language, where life is hard for an immigrant. And they did that so that my generation can have the opportunities that I've had in my life. I have been able to pursue my dreams because of the stability that the immigrants in my family were able to give me, both my grandparents on my mom's side and my dad himself on his side, who moved here for college. And, I'm forever grateful for their struggles and indebted to their struggles, and want to do everything possible um, to make the most of the fact that they work so hard for my sake. But the reason I started thinking about public service was the when I started thinking about public service was when I was about 8 years old. The earthquakes in Gujarat had just happened, I think in 2001, and I was watching it on the news, and I told my mom, what's happening to all these kids in India who've lost their homes and can't go to school. And her first response was always, okay, you see this problem, this, crisis going on. You care. What are you going to do about it? And so I did. I started my first fundraiser when I was 8 years old for the Red Cross, to, on a small scale, but it was whatever an 8-year-old was able to do at the time. Similarly, I actually moved to India for a few years. I lived there for 5 years in high school in Bangalore. And, I saw poverty in just a different light. I was living in this, nice little gated community, and right outside were communities of with really, really, truly impoverished people. They were neighborhood schools with barely any facilities, with just the bare bones facilities to provide an education, no library, no computers, no things like that. And I realized, I was so fortunate to have thousands of books at my disposal, and books supplement your education as a child and make you creative and help you understand different life paths. And so, again, I saw a problem, and my mom said, what are you going to do about it? So I started a nonprofit when I was about 15 in Bangalore that set up libraries in under-researched schools in my neighborhood. And, I did it with the support of my family, who have been only encouraging to support me in giving back to my community and being a public servant. So that's, the roots of where it lies. And I've, of course, continued down that road later in my career. But the foundation of where you come from and making the most of the privileges that I've had in my life, this is a theme that I care about. I'm extremely, extremely fortunate to have had, a stable home, a stable family, a good education, and I feel called to give back because of that.
If I may, I want to transition from your core philosophies and your background now to your ideas and opinions on three core issues. Those issues are COVID, human trafficking and maternal care, and finally, the confluence of criminal justice, environmental reform, and domestic violence. So let me start with what's on all of our minds, which is COVID. You currently serve on the California Commission on Asian and Pacific Islander American Affairs, and approximately 25% of the District 18 is made up of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. So What specifically would you do to ensure that California is able to respond effectively to the long-term impacts COVID has had on the Asian community, especially with the current rise of targeted hate crimes?
Yeah. There's two things that the API Commission is focused on that I care deeply about, and one is access. Who has access to healthcare? Who has access to information about COVID, information about where to get vaccines? What languages are these resources available in matters. Um, Unfortunately, with our COVID vaccine rollout and when testing started to become more common, there were certain communities that had access to it and others that didn't. And so the word API is really broad, Asian and Pacific Islander. This encompasses the majority of the world's population. And I think it's an extremely broad term. And different communities that fall under these categories experience different rates of COVID. For example, Hmong and Cambodian communities suffer, I believe, higher rates of COVID than African American communities, and higher Filipino communities have higher death rates than Chinese communities. And we overlook some of these statistics and the need to address certain populations because we lump people into this overarching term. And so, one thing the API Commission cares a lot about is data disaggregation. Let's disaggregate what who is experiencing what types of health inequities, who is experiencing what kinds of education and access inequities, which of these communities are monolingual non-English speakers, which of these communities have the resources, and where do we need to focus our energies. So access to resources that are language accessible and culturally relevant matters. And as we make sure that as we transition out of COVID, hopefully soon, and prepare for future pandemics and disasters, because this is not the last one we're going to be experiencing. Um, but more broadly, my biggest takeaway from COVID is about access to health.
Mhm.
30% of Californians do not have true insurance coverage, do not have real insurance coverage, and 3 million are completely uninsured. The pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in health worse than it's already been in the past. And so, coming from a background of in public health, after college, my first job was working at a community health clinic as a home visiting case manager, and later as the clinic's social services coordinator. You know, I saw what happens to people who don't have health insurance because it's too expensive. Many people don't. The threshold for being eligible for Medicaid is so low. You have to be making absolutely nothing to qualify for Medicaid. And the gap between that and people who can afford health insurance if their job doesn't cover it is huge. There are millions of people who fall through the cracks. And it impacts your life outcomes. It's not surprising that some of the parts of California, some of the parts of my district, the 18th district, that are experiencing the highest rates of COVID are also some of the communities with the highest rates of uninsurance or underinsurance. If you consistently see a doctor from your childhood onward, if you've gotten all your vaccinations, if you have your well checkups, if you have all the tests you're supposed to, that is preventative care, and that's going to prevent long-term health conditions in the future, or at least address them. If you are only going to the emergency room when you're sick, and that's the only time you ever see medical staff, that's going to impact your life outcomes, particularly for things like diabetes, asthma, heart disease, other conditions that are very much preventable and treatable from earlier on. And this matters when it comes to, your other question about maternal health. It matters for maternal mortality rates as well. There are certain populations, for example, Black communities, where a mother is 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. They have 3 to 4 times higher rates of maternal mortality than their white counterparts. And that's not just because of 9 months of prenatal care. that has to do with what's called social determinants of health, one of which includes preventative care. Have you been regularly seeing a doctor your entire life? Have you had access to healthy food growing up? Do you live in a household that has violence in it? Because that impacts your health outcomes too. These are things that impact whether or not you might be susceptible to disease like COVID. This impacts your maternal mortality rates, life expectancy rates. In my district alone, you have certain zip codes in Deep East Oakland, for example, where someone's lifespan is 10 years shorter than someone's a mile away in the Oakland Hills. And so this matters. This is not a coincidence where lack of healthcare and lack of access to healthcare impacts life outcomes, impacts susceptibility to diseases. So my biggest takeaway from COVID is the need to implement universal healthcare.
Thank you for that. I learned so much from just that one answer. Thank you for that. Young students missed many, many days of school. And as a family-centered magazine, I think our readers and I were extremely curious to know, do you see yourself making the revival and rehabilitation of education post-COVID a cornerstone of your efforts and campaign? And if so, how do you believe that the California State Assembly can support that effort?
Yeah, so California went from in the 70s being the state with the crown jewel of public education to today ranking 41 out of 50 among our states in dollars spent per child. This was a drastic shift from having literally one of the best public education systems in the country to now having one of the worst. And we need to reinvest in students now. We need to implement universal preschool, because the age of 0 to 5 is the most crucial for brain development, and that sets the stage for your entire life. And we need to make sure that every child, before they enter kindergarten at age 5 or so, has had some kind of educational foundation before that coming in. And then we need to invest better in public K through 12 education. The situation is really dire and only getting worse throughout COVID. We need, which involves funding. We need to get Prop 13 back on the ballot and unite Californians to pass it. The reason why we went from the 70s to having one of the best and most well-funded education system to one of the worst is because of Prop 13, which cut our tax revenue significantly and prevented California dollars being used towards public education. And we need to ramp that up. We need to implement tax and revenue measures to get closer to where we need to be to go back to the system we once had. And we also need to think strategically about how we deal with the past year plus of inequitable education, of education that has not, a system that has not served everyone. Online learning is not the same, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm not an education expert. I'm not a brain development expert. I'm not a child psychologist. So one of my priorities would be to work with the people who are. Too often, our state lawmakers pretend they know the answers to things like to issues that they don't actually know about. So what I would do is convene a statewide commission with child psychologists, with education experts, with teachers associations to understand what do we need to do to recover from this year plus of online education, and for many kids, no education at all. So that's one thing. The other thing is both children in high school as well as many people in community colleges have been dropping out. Community colleges, there's some that have lost up to 30 to 50% of their student body, because why would you be paying for school when you're just sitting on Zoom, when you could be working a job to help your family members instead, or taking care of your siblings that need to be at home, homeschooling or things like that. And we need to incentivize students to re-enroll in both high school and community colleges, and support them in the ways that they need to. I think schools should be a center of learning, but also life support for families that can't afford, have not been able to afford food in the pandemic. We need to reintroduce the concept of food pantries based in school. We need to reintroduce the concept of diaper banks in schools and school-based mental health. The health clinic that I worked for, we had school-based mental health therapists for children as young as being in elementary school. And we need to refund these programs so that a student is supported in the school environment, not only to learn math and science and English, but to be supported in their mental and emotional growth for almost for everyone, which is taken a big toll in the past year and a half of the pandemic.
I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot now to the second core topic of issues, which is human trafficking and maternal care. Areas within District 18 which you would be representing are some of the absolute worst for child sex trafficking and human trafficking, even during the pandemic. What do you see as the California Assembly's role in combating human trafficking and modern day slavery?
Yeah. It's tragic that we have people as young as age 12 being trafficked, sometimes even younger, into our systems. And it is extremely common and not talked about. And the people who are victims of trafficking, who are children and teenagers, don't get the support they need. And we need to start by shifting our mindset towards the issue of trafficking. It starts with first recognizing how prevalent this is, as you mentioned. It is common, it happens everywhere, it happens with every ethnic group in this state. No one's left out of this process. Everyone, there are people being trafficked of every ethnic origin. Second, we need to make sure that children who are vulnerable to trafficking are supported. A lot of children who are trafficked do not have stable homes. Many live in foster care. Um, Many, even if they do live at home, do not have supportive family structures. They have schools where folks are not adequately supported, and we need to do everything possible so that these vulnerable children have a place that they can turn to where they can talk openly to people in their schools, talk openly to, like I mentioned, school-based mental health therapists and counselors, um, in order to make sure that they're supported not just in math and science and reading and writing, but also in their mental and emotional growth. So if home might not feel like a safe place, school should feel like a safe place. Other environments need to feel safe enough for a child so that they don't turn to the predatory individuals who traffic them, to the pimps who hang out in the malls and are waiting, for these young children, mostly girls, to try to traffic them. Yeah, and there are a lot of specific policy proposals that are being brought by the statewide coalition against human trafficking, statewide coalition against domestic violence. Another angle of it that I saw from the healthcare perspective is medical screenings. I remember learning, the health clinic I worked for, we had 5 clinics across 2 cities, and over 60, 70,000 patients a year. And when someone told me, we have human trafficking survivors sitting in our patient waiting rooms every single day, that blew my mind. I'm like, how can they be here and we not offer services? And they often come with their traffickers, with their pimps. And I mean, there's some horrifying circumstances, but we don't recognize, because we don't recognize it's a problem. We don't take measures to like implement screening and thinking about how to address it, because we often assume that, all right, someone's coming with their parents, someone's coming with their sibling or cousin or a close friend, and we don't take steps to really think, who is this person coming with, why are they here, what's causing them to have physical injuries, emotional injuries, what are the trauma informed ways we can talk to someone who's being trafficked, because it's hard, and it's going to involve people who understand the dynamics of trafficking including individuals that were formerly trafficked themselves. Again, when I say policymakers think they often have the answers and they don't, this is absolutely one of them. Some of the best anti-trafficking organizations are founded and led by women who were formerly trafficked themselves because they understand. And we need to make sure that their voices are included and centered in thinking about solutions.
I agree. When I was learning more about you, what's something that like stood out so prominently is that a lot of your perspective and interaction with the California legislative system is rooted in your extensive experience working with mothers, both as an attorney and as a volunteer, and specifically mothers who have been through domestic violence, immigrant mothers. My question is, state budget revisions due to COVID might target maternal and child health programs that support the mothers you worked so relentlessly hard to protect and nurture and care for. How would you prioritize and ensure funding for those programs if you were elected?
Yeah, my philosophy is if the state wants to find funding for something, we absolutely can. When we set our mind to deciding that this is something we value, this is something we care about, this should be a fundamental human right, then we have the means to prioritize it. We have the means to expedite bills. We have the means to pour whatever sources of funding that we have, if we make it a priority. Maternal and infant health is not always considered an immediate priority. And what determines what are priorities for a lot of lawmakers is going back to who's paying them. What corporate interests are making sure they are choosing to fund the initiatives they want. What corporate interests are saying, no, you should prioritize our issues instead. And it also goes back to education and outreach. We don't have very many legislators who have done social work. We don't have very many legislators, if any, who have been in family courtrooms and understand how horrifying it is for a survivor of domestic violence to go out and seek a civil restraining order. And that lack of understanding what the system has to do with, our state legislature is not diverse at all. We don't have gender representation. We don't have ethnic representation. We don't have representation of people from different backgrounds. I mean, my district, for example, is over 70% renters over homeowners. In our legislature, there are all of two renters out of 120 legislators.
Wow.
Our population is significantly higher than having 2 out of 120 people be renters. It's the importance of having different perspectives that I believe set our budget priorities, and we need more of that in maternal and childhood development for sure. Because if we had enough lawmakers that cared, we would have universal preschool. We would have universal home visiting programs for, like the one that I was part of, for new mothers and for children. We would have systems in place. But the program that I was working for initially as a home-based case manager has been cut drastically over the years, all across the country. And we need to make these things a priority again.
This ties into everything we've spoken about so far. The common theme has been you have been on the ground, you've sort of seen things with your own eyes, and now you want to take it to a big scale. So, how do you see local nonprofits, the ones you've worked so closely with, the ones that have informed who you are, and the California State Assembly actually working together to help fight not only the issues we've discussed, but also specifically intersectional issues of environmental reform, criminal justice reform, and domestic violence?
Yeah, I'll answer that through an example. So, one of the organizations that I've been on the board of for a few years is called Men Creating Peace. And it's a program that works with domestic violence batterers. So, people, men specifically, who have committed violence against their partners in the past. And this program was founded and is facilitated by people who were mostly former batterers themselves and went through similar life changing programs and know what it takes to help someone turn around their life. No one is born inherently violent. No one is born with anger issues in their blood. I mean, there's certain genetic traits, but like for the most part, you don't become an abusive person just because of the way you're born. You're socialized to cause violence in the way that people who commit domestic violence do. And our system, unfortunately, we focus so much on punishment for crimes that we don't focus on the rehabilitation part of it. Um, this is, for example, a program that spans over 52 weeks. You have weekly classes where, and I've attended several of them, and the men have to do extremely hard work, hard emotional work to understand what caused them to become violent. What were the roots of some of these causes? Did it stem from their family? Did it stem from their own trauma in their life? There's a saying that hurt people hurt people. And a lot of the times, people who cause harm and violence were impacted by violence themselves or grew up in homes with violence themselves. And rather than labeling someone as they're just an abuser and that's who they are, we need to shift our focus to organizations like this one that I work with that does the powerful work of rehabilitating someone and helping someone change their life around. And unfortunately, programs like these are not funded by the state, are rarely funded by counties. And many are going underwater or deeply suffering because of the economic impacts of COVID. And we need to reinvest in community solutions that work. We need to reinvest in mental health services. We need to invest in culturally centered models of healing. There are, what's going to work for someone from an Indian community might be different for someone from a Latino community, who might be different from someone from a Native American background. But we have solutions. We don't need to only rely on Western, philosophies of how you should be rehabilitated or how you should be treated. We should incorporate our culture, our values, and make sure that these services are affordable and accessible to people that want them.
I want to conclude by asking you a couple of sort of final personal reflection questions. And
Mhm.
my first one is, like I mentioned, you have zero corporate backing. How exactly can you defeat your opponents who maybe have not only more experience, but more finances because of this corporate backing?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is where all of you listening to this interview can come in and support. I rely on grassroots contributions from people like you, from our broader South Asian and Indian communities, and people from all over. But I rely on individuals, and I have a long way to go to meet my goals. This is a very, very deeply competitive race happening in 8 weeks. Um, we only found out it was going to be happening in 8 weeks 2 days ago. So I have had to completely revamp my strategy, completely rethink how I'm going to win this election. And I know I can, but I need the assistance of all of you. This is not being a political leader and wanting to represent South Asians in government and wanting to represent our communities cannot happen alone. If we want to uplift more Indian Americans in government, if we want to uplift more South Asian women, which we have none in Sacramento, we don't have a single South Asian woman who's an assembly member, a state senator, or holding any role. Kamala Harris was the only woman of South Asian descent to hold any power in Sacramento, any significant role in Sacramento state government. So I would be the very first South Asian woman in our state assembly or state senate. So it's one thing to celebrate the achievements of people like Kamala Harris once they're in office and once they've achieved what they've achieved, but it takes villages, it takes so many communities to help someone get there. And right now, I know that I can't do it alone, and I'm asking for all of your support. And I've posted a link to my contribution page and would love if anyone listening to this can please consider chipping in.
And finally, I want to ask, what has been your biggest obstacle or the biggest challenge in your entire campaign process so far? And what has been your biggest revelation about yourself during this process?
The challenge is definitely money. Um, and a state assembly race on average, a successful state assembly race costs over $1 million, $1.2 million. That's something that I can't dream of achieving, which is why people like me don't run for seats like this. But I believe that we can overcome that, perhaps not with $1 million in the next 8 weeks, but with enough to reach 500,000 voters. There are 500,000 people who live in my district, who live in every California district has 500,000 people. That's just how we're broken up, and it's massive. It's larger than the districts of most legislative seats in other states. But that's how it is. My biggest challenge is raising the money to be able to access 500,000 people. Um, and the biggest revelation is that I know I can do it. And there is a path to victory. And I know I'm doing everything in my capacity to make sure I'm on it.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Janani, for speaking with us today. And to all of our viewers, again, if Janani's message resonates with you the way it does with us, with me, we really, really encourage you to support the campaign and help elect the first Indian American Assemblywoman. The link to support her campaign is going to be below in the description. And thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful day.